The moment I heard my sister-in-law suggest I sit at the kids' table, I felt something inside me crack. Not break, just crack. Like ice on a pond when the temperature drops too fast. I was 38 years old, a mother of 2, and apparently not worthy of sitting with the real adults at Thanksgiving dinner. Before we jump back into this story, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "Sarah, honey," Jennifer said with that syrupy voice she reserved for delivering insults wrapped in kindness. "We're a little short on space at the main table, and since you're so good with children, maybe you could keep an eye on the little ones." She gestured toward the card table in the corner, the one decorated with paper turkeys and plastic plates, where my 7-year-old son Marcus was already seated alongside 3 of his younger cousins. I stood there in the doorway of my brother's dining room, holding a homemade sweet potato casserole that had taken me 3 hours to prepare, watching as Jennifer rearranged place cards to make room for her book club friends. Women I'd never met before today, but who apparently deserved to sit with the adults more than I did. The worst part wasn't the humiliation. The worst part was that nobody said anything. My brother David glanced up from carving the turkey, caught my eye for just a second, then looked away like he hadn't seen anything at all. My mother, who was arranging dinner rolls in a basket, suddenly became very interested in making sure each roll was perfectly positioned. Even my father, who I'd always counted on to speak up when things weren't right, was deep in conversation with David's father-in-law about football scores. So I smiled. I nodded. I said, "Of course, no problem. At all." And I walked over to that kid's table with as much dignity as I could manage, which wasn't much. Marcus looked up at me with those big brown eyes that reminded me so much of his father, and I could see the question there. The confusion. He was old enough to understand that something wasn't quite right about his mom sitting at the kids' table, but young enough not to know how to process it. I ruffled his hair and took the tiny plastic chair next to him, my knees practically touching my chin. "This is actually perfect," I whispered to him, forcing brightness into my voice. "Now I get to sit next to my favorite person." He smiled at that, but I could tell he wasn't buying it completely. Marcus had always been perceptive, even as a toddler. It was one of the things that made him special, this ability to read people and situations with an accuracy that sometimes surprised me. The dinner conversation from the adult table drifted over to us in fragments. Stock portfolios and vacation homes in the Hamptons, private school applications and country club memberships, Jennifer's recent promotion to partner at her law firm, David's new Tesla. The kind of casual name-dropping that made it clear these were people who had never worried about choosing between paying the electric bill and buying groceries. I tried to focus on the children around me instead. Marcus and his cousin Emma were deep in a discussion about Pokemon cards. Little Tyler, who was only 4, was methodically separating his mashed potatoes from his green beans like his life depended on it. These kids didn't care about stock portfolios or luxury cars. They cared about whether the turkey was too dry and whether there would be enough pie for seconds. But I couldn't completely block out the adult conversation, especially when I heard Jennifer launch into her favorite topic, my life choices. "I just don't understand how Sarah manages," she was saying, her voice carrying that perfect blend of concern and judgment that she'd mastered over the years. "I mean, raising 2 kids on a teacher's salary, in that neighborhood, and she's still renting, isn't she? At her age?" My fork paused halfway to my mouth. Marcus glanced at me, and I forced another smile, pretending I hadn't heard. But my ears were burning, and I could feel that familiar tightness in my chest that came whenever people discussed my life like I wasn't in the room. "Well, teaching is noble work," someone else chimed in, and I recognized the voice as belonging to one of Jennifer's book club friends. "But it's not exactly lucrative, is it? I don't know how anyone expects to build a real future on that kind of income." "That's what I keep telling David," Jennifer continued. "Sarah needs to think practically. Maybe get her real estate license or something. Teaching is fine as a backup plan, but at some point, you have to face reality. Face reality, as if I hadn't been facing reality every single day for the past 15 years. As if I didn't know exactly what my bank account looked like, or what it felt like to clip coupons and shop sales and still come up short at the end of the month sometimes. As if I hadn't been making impossible choices and somehow making them work month after month, year after year. I took a careful breath and cut a piece of turkey for Tyler, who was still focused on his mashed potato engineering project. Marcus had gone quiet beside me, and I knew he was listening too. He was always listening, always absorbing more than I realized. The thing is, they weren't entirely wrong about the money. Teaching didn't pay much, especially in our district. I brought home about $42,000 a year before taxes, which in a city like ours meant every dollar had to be stretched until it screamed. Our apartment was small, a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades. The carpet was worn thin in places, and the kitchen faucet had a drip I couldn't afford to fix, but it was clean and safe, and it was ours. I drove a 12-year-old Honda Civic that my students sometimes joked looked older than they were. The paint was faded, there was a dent in the passenger door from where I'd backed into a pole 2 years ago, and the air conditioning only worked if you hit the dashboard in exactly the right spot. But it got me to work and back, and the payments were manageable. My clothes came mostly from discount stores and end-of-season sales. I'd gotten good at finding pieces that looked more expensive than they were, at mixing and matching to create the illusion of a larger wardrobe. The dress I was wearing today, a simple navy blue shift that I thought looked appropriate for Thanksgiving dinner, had cost me $18 at an outlet store 6 months ago. So no, I wasn't building wealth the way Jennifer and David were. I wasn't contributing to a retirement fund or saving for a down payment on a house. Most months, I was just trying to make sure Marcus and his older sister Lily had what they needed. School supplies and decent shoes, birthday presents that didn't scream clearance rack, the occasional movie or dinner out, because even kids on a budget deserved some fun. But here's what they didn't know, what nobody at that table knew. I wasn't just a teacher. For the past 3 years, while they were assuming I was struggling and failing and barely keeping my head above water, I had been building something else entirely. Something that started as a side project, a way to make a few extra dollars in the evenings after Marcus and Lily were asleep. Something that had grown slowly, quietly, without fanfare or announcement, until it became something I hardly dared to believe was real. It started with frustration, actually. Frustration with the educational technology being used in our schools. Systems that were clunky and outdated, interfaces that confused both teachers and students. Platforms that promised to revolutionize learning, but actually made everything more complicated. I'd spent enough late nights fighting with gradebook, software, and attendance systems to know there had to be a better way. So I started sketching out ideas, simple mock-ups of what a better system might look like. User-friendly interfaces that actually made sense. Features that would genuinely help teachers instead of creating more work for them. I didn't know much about coding or software development, but I knew about teaching, and I knew about what teachers needed. Those sketches turned into more detailed designs. I started teaching myself basic programming through free online courses, staying up until midnight and beyond, learning HTML and CSS and JavaScript in stolen moments between grading papers, and doing laundry. I watched YouTube tutorials while washing dishes. I read coding forums during my lunch breaks. Slowly, those designs became prototypes. Basic, clunky versions of the educational software I'd been imagining. I tested them in my own classroom, refined them based on what worked and what didn't. Other teachers in my district started asking about the tools I was using, wondering if they could try them too. That's when I realized I might be onto something bigger than just solving my own problems. I spent my summer break 2 years ago completely immersed in development, turning my amateur prototypes into something that actually worked reliably. I incorporated as an LLC, partly because it seemed like the professional thing to do, and partly because I needed some kind of legal structure if I was going to start licensing my software to other schools. The first district that signed on was small, just 3 elementary schools about an hour outside the city. They paid me $12,000 for a 1-year license to use my classroom management platform. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more money than I'd ever made from anything other than teaching. More importantly, it was proof that what I'd built had real value. That $12,000 became $36,000 the next year as word spread and more districts wanted to try my platform. Then $84,000, then $250,000. Each contract validation that I wasn't crazy, that this thing I'd built in my spare time actually solved problems that real schools were willing to pay to have solved. The growth was slow at first, then faster than I knew how to handle. Districts weren't just licensing my classroom management software anymore. They wanted the student progress tracking system I'd developed, the parent communication portal that actually worked the way parents expected it to work, the scheduling system that could handle the complexity of modern schools without requiring a computer science degree to operate. I was still teaching full-time because the income from my software company wasn't quite steady enough yet to replace my salary entirely. But it was getting close. Close enough that I'd started having conversations with my principal about possibly reducing my course load next year. Close enough that I'd been looking at houses instead of apartments, imagining what it might be like to have a yard for Marcus to play in. 6 months ago, everything changed. I got an email from a journalist at Forbes. At first, I thought it was spam or some kind of mistake. The subject line read, "Interview request, EdTech entrepreneurs to watch," and I almost deleted it without opening it. But curiosity got the better of me. The journalist had somehow found out about my company, EduFlow Solutions, and wanted to include me in an article about educators who were disrupting the educational technology space. She wanted to know about my journey from classroom teacher to software entrepreneur, about the challenges I'd faced and the successes I'd achieved. The interview was surreal, sitting in my small apartment, talking on the phone with a Forbes journalist while Marcus watched cartoons in the next room, trying to explain how I'd accidentally built a business while just trying to make my own job easier. She asked thoughtful questions about the intersection of education and technology, about the unique perspective that actual teachers brought to software development, about the challenges of bootstrapping a tech company while working full-time in an unrelated field. The article came out 3 weeks later. 10 EdTech entrepreneurs revolutionizing education from the ground up, with my photo and story featured prominently. They called me a teacher-turned-tech CEO who's proving that the best educational software comes from people who actually understand education. They mentioned that my company had grown to serve over 40 school districts across 3 states, with annual revenue approaching the 7-figure mark. But here's the thing that really got me. They didn't just put the article online. They featured it on the cover of the print magazine, the actual physical Forbes magazine that sits on newsstands, and in doctors' offices and in the hands of business leaders across the country. My name was on the cover of Forbes. I bought 10 copies that day. 10 copies of a magazine with my name on the cover, because I couldn't quite believe it was real. I kept one on my kitchen counter, one in my car, one in my desk at school. I gave one to my mother and one to my best friend. The rest I tucked away in a box, like they were precious artifacts instead of newsstand magazines. My students were more excited about it than I was, I think. Word spread through the school quickly, and suddenly I was the teacher whose picture was in Forbes magazine. The principal called me into her office, not to scold me, but to congratulate me and ask if I needed any accommodations to manage both my teaching responsibilities and my growing business. My revenue jumped again after the article came out. School. Districts that had never heard of EduFlow Solutions were suddenly requesting demos and pilot programs. Education conferences were inviting me to speak. Other entrepreneurs were reaching out, wanting to collaborate or asking for advice about their own edtech startups. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't worried about money. not actively worried anyway. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for 15 years, the one that woke me up at 3 in the morning calculating whether I could afford both groceries and gas, had finally started to quiet down. But I didn't tell anyone about any of this. Not my family, not my friends, not even my kids. Partly because it still felt too new, too fragile to talk about out loud. Partly because I'd learned that people had strong opinions about teachers who made money, as if choosing education meant taking a vow of perpetual financial struggle. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And partly because I'd grown tired of being underestimated. There was something powerful about knowing that people saw me one way while the reality was completely different. Something satisfying about letting them make their assumptions while I quietly built something they couldn't even imagine. So when Jennifer suggested I sit at the kids' table, when she launched into her analysis of my poor life choices and financial instability, I didn't say anything. I just sat there with my knees folded up to my chest, listening to her explain how I needed to face reality and get practical about my career. I watched my brother David nod along with her assessment, agreeing that maybe I should consider real estate or insurance or something that might actually pay the bills. I listened to the book club friends discuss the challenges of living paycheck to paycheck, speaking about financial struggle like it was an exotic disease they'd read about but never experienced. And I smiled and cut up turkey for Tyler and helped Emma find the cranberry sauce, because that's what good aunts do at kids' tables. But inside, I was thinking about the email that had come in just that morning. Another school district, this one in California, wanting to sign a 3-year contract worth $400,000. I was thinking about the house I'd put an offer on 2 weeks ago, the one with the big backyard and the updated kitchen and the mortgage payment that wouldn't keep me awake at night. I was thinking about the retirement account I'd finally been able to start funding and the college savings accounts I'd opened for both Marcus and Lily. Most of all, I was thinking about the moment when all of this would come out. Because it would come out, eventually. Success has a way of becoming visible, no matter how quietly you try to build it. And when it did, when they realized that the woman they'd relegated to the kids' table was actually featured on the cover of Forbes magazine, I wondered what they would say. Marcus finished his dinner and leaned against my shoulder, tired from the long day and the rich food. I wrapped my arm around him and felt him relax into me, his weight solid and warm and familiar. Whatever else was happening, whatever complicated feelings I had about my family and their assumptions about my life, this part was simple. This part was clear. He was 7 years old enough to understand more than adults gave him credit, for young enough to still need me to cut his meat and remind him to use his napkin. He was smart and curious and kind, with a sense of justice that sometimes surprised me with its clarity. He noticed when things weren't fair, and he wasn't afraid to say so. Which is probably why, when Jennifer's voice carried over from the adult table again, making another comment about my situation, and how I really needed to think about the children's future, Marcus sat up straight and looked at me with those serious brown eyes. "Mom," he said, loud enough that the adult table could hear, but quiet enough that it felt like he was just talking to me. "Can I show them something?" The question hung in the air between us, and I felt my heart skip. Marcus was looking at me with an expression I'd seen before, usually right before he asked if he could tell his teacher about something important that had happened at home. It was his "I have something to share" face, and it both thrilled and terrified me. "Show them." "What, sweetheart?" I asked, though part of me already knew where this was heading. Marcus had been in my home office enough times to see the magazine covers I'd framed and hung on the wall. He'd overheard enough phone calls with school districts and journalists to understand that Mommy did something important with computers. And he was 7 years old, which meant he had absolutely no filter when it came to sharing information he thought was relevant. He was already sliding off his plastic chair, reaching for the small backpack he'd brought with him today. I'd assumed it was full of toys and games to keep him occupied during the long dinner. But as he unzipped it with the focused determination of someone on a mission, I realized I might have been wrong. "I brought something," he said, his voice carrying that careful pronunciation he used when he was trying to sound very grown up. "For show and tell. But not school show and tell. Family show and tell." My stomach dropped. Marcus had a habit of bringing home my business cards from my desk, collecting them like some kids collected stickers. He also had a habit of taking pictures with my phone when I wasn't paying attention, usually selfies but sometimes photos of things around the house that caught his interest. Like the framed Forbes magazine cover hanging in my office. "Marcus," I started, but he was already pulling something out of his backpack with the kind of reverence usually reserved for Christmas morning. It was a manila folder, the kind I used for important documents, and I recognized it immediately. It was the folder where I kept copies of all the articles and press coverage EduFlow Solutions had received over the past year. "Mom told me to always be proud of our family," Marcus announced, loud enough that the conversation at the adult table began to quiet down. "And I want to show everyone why I'm proud of my mom." The dining room had gone from the comfortable buzz of holiday conversation to something approaching silence. Jennifer had stopped mid-sentence in whatever she was saying about vacation planning. David had put down his fork. Even the other children at our table had turned to watch Marcus with the kind of attention kids usually reserved for magic tricks. I should have stopped him. I should have gently taken the folder and suggested we save show and tell for later, after dinner, maybe in private with just Grandma and Grandpa. But there was something in his voice, something so genuinely proud and excited that I couldn't bring myself to shut him down. Besides, a small rebellious part of me was curious to see what would happen. Marcus opened the folder with careful fingers and pulled out a printout of the Forbes article. Not just the text, but a color copy of the actual magazine cover, with my photo and the headline clearly visible. He held it up like he was presenting a school project, turning slightly so both tables could see. "This is my mom," he said, his 7-year-old voice carrying across the room with perfect clarity. "She's on the cover of Forbes magazine because she built a company that helps schools work better. She makes computer programs that teachers use, and lots of schools buy them." The silence that followed was different from the polite quiet that had preceded it. This was the kind of silence that happens when people are trying to process information that doesn't fit with what they thought they knew. I could see Jennifer's expression change from confusion to something like shock, her eyes moving from Marcus to the printout to me and back again. "Forbes?" My mother's voice came from the adult table, high and surprised. "Sarah, you never mentioned..." But Marcus wasn't finished. He'd pulled out another piece of paper, this one a printout of an email I'd received last month from the CEO of a major educational technology conference, inviting me to be a keynote speaker. He couldn't read all the words, but he'd obviously had help understanding what it meant. "And this is a letter asking Mom to come talk to lots of important people about her business," he continued, warming to his audience now. "Because she's really good at making computer stuff for schools. She works on her computer after I go to bed, and sometimes she talks to people on the phone about buying her programs." I felt heat rising in my cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from something more complicated. Pride mixed with anxiety, satisfaction mixed with the fear that this wasn't how I'd wanted this information to come out. I'd imagined telling my family about my success eventually, but in a controlled way, at a time and place of my choosing. Not through my 7-year-old's impromptu presentation at a Thanksgiving dinner where I'd just been demoted to the kids' table. David was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Sarah, is this real? You're really on the cover." "Of Forbes?" Before I could answer, Marcus had pulled out his phone. My phone, actually, which he'd apparently taken from my purse without me noticing. He'd somehow navigated to the photo gallery and found the picture I'd taken of myself holding The physical magazine copy when it first came out. "Look," he said, holding up the phone with the pride of someone presenting definitive evidence. "This is Mom with the real magazine. She bought lots of copies and gave them to people, and she has it hanging on the wall in her office at home." Jennifer's book club friends were leaning forward now, trying to get a better look at the phone screen. I could see them whispering to each other, probably trying to figure out if this was some kind of elaborate joke or misunderstanding. After all, the woman they'd been discussing just minutes ago, the one who supposedly couldn't manage financially and needed to get practical about her career, couldn't possibly be the same person featured on the cover of America's premier business magazine. "Marcus," I said gently, finally finding my voice, "maybe we should put these away for now and finish our dinner." But he shook his head with the determination of a child who knows he's sharing something important. "I want everyone to know that my mom is really smart and really good at business. Because sometimes people think teachers can't do other stuff too, but my mom does teaching and business, and she's really good at both." The accuracy of that statement hit me like a physical blow. Somehow, my 7-year-old had identified exactly what was happening here. Exactly why this moment felt so loaded with meaning. People did think teachers couldn't do other things too. They thought choosing education meant accepting limitations, financial and otherwise. They thought being good with children meant you couldn't be good with spreadsheets or code or business development. My brother David cleared his throat. "Sarah, can I see that?" He gestured toward the Forbes printout, and Marcus walked it over to him with the solemnity of someone delivering important documents. David studied it for a long moment, his eyes moving over the text and the photos. "This says your company serves 40 school districts," he said slowly, "and that your annual revenue is approaching 7 figures. He looked up at me, and I could see him trying to reconcile this information with the assumptions he'd been making about my life. 7 figures means... "It means Mom makes a lot of money from her business," Marcus supplied helpfully. "More than she makes from teaching. But she likes teaching too, so she does both." Jennifer had gone very quiet. The book club friends were staring at me like I'd just revealed I was secretly a superhero, which, in a way, I suppose I had. The woman who they'd assumed was struggling financially, who they'd just been discussing in terms of poor choices and limited options, was apparently running a successful technology company. My mother had gotten up from her chair and was walking over to our table, her hand extended toward the printout. "May I?" she asked, and David handed it to her. She read it in silence, her lips moving slightly as she worked through the technical language and business terminology. "Sweetheart," she said finally, looking at me with an expression that mixed pride and hurt and confusion. "Why didn't you tell us about this? This is incredible. This is..." She gestured helplessly at the magazine cover. "This is huge." That was the question I'd been dreading, and I wasn't sure how to answer it honestly without sounding bitter or defensive. "How do you explain that? You didn't share your success because you'd grown tired of being underestimated? How do you tell your family that you'd kept quiet about your achievements because you weren't sure they'd believe them or support them?" "I guess I was waiting for the right time," I said, which was true but not complete. It all happened so fast, and I wasn't sure how to bring it up. Marcus had returned to his seat next to me, but he wasn't done with his presentation yet. He'd pulled out one more item from his folder, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw what it was. It was a printout of an email thread between me and my real estate agent discussing the house I'd put an offer on, the house with the big backyard and the updated kitchen, and the mortgage I could now comfortably afford. "And Mom is buying us a new house," Marcus announced, "with a yard for me to play in and a bigger room for Lily and an office just for Mom's business computer. The real estate lady says it's a really nice house in a really good neighborhood." The silence that followed was complete. Even the children at our table had gone quiet, sensing that something significant was happening in the adult world that they didn't quite understand but knew was important. Jennifer was the first to speak, and her voice was different now, smaller, You're buying a house? What kind of house? I realized that this was the moment where I could either downplay everything, try to minimize the scope of what I'd achieved, or I could own it completely. I could let them see the full extent of what I'd built while they'd been assuming I was struggling. A 4-bedroom colonial in Maple Heights, I said, naming the neighborhood that everyone at this table knew was expensive and desirable. We're supposed to close next month. David's fork clattered against his plate. Maple Heights? Sarah, houses in Maple Heights start at what, 400,000? 500, I corrected quietly, for anything decent. The math was clearly working itself out in everyone's heads. If I could afford a house in Maple Heights, if my company was generating 7-figure revenue, if I was being featured in Forbes and invited to speak at conferences, then everything they'd assumed about my financial situation was not just wrong, but dramatically wrong. My mother was still holding the magazine printout, staring at my photo like she was seeing me for the first time. Sarah, honey, I don't understand. If you've been doing so well, why are you still teaching? Why didn't you tell us you were building a business? That was the heart of it, really. The question that got to the core of why this whole situation felt so complex and loaded. Why was I still teaching if I didn't have to? Why had I kept my success secret? Why had I let them go on believing I was struggling when the reality was so different? Because I love teaching, I said, and I meant it. The business grew out of trying to solve problems I was having in my classroom. It's not separate from education, it's an extension of it. And I didn't want to have to choose between being an educator and being an entrepreneur. Marcus was nodding along like this made perfect sense to him, which it probably did. Kids are good at understanding that people can be more than one thing at the same time, that you don't have to fit into neat categories or choose just one identity. Besides, I continued, looking around the table at my family, I've learned that people have strong reactions when teachers make money. There's this idea that choosing education means you should accept being poor, that making a profit somehow compromises your dedication to kids. I wasn't ready to deal with those judgments. Jennifer's face had gone through several color changes during this conversation, settling finally on a pale pink that suggested she was remembering everything she'd said about my financial situation and career choices over the past few hours. Sarah, I had no idea. I mean, when I suggested you get your real estate license, I was just trying to help. I know, I said, and I did know. Jennifer wasn't malicious, just trapped in the same assumptions that most people made about teachers, and money and success. It's okay, really. But Marcus, who had been quietly organizing his papers back into the folder, looked up with that serious expression again. It's not okay, he said firmly. You made Mom sit at the kids' table because you thought she wasn't important enough for the grown-up table. But she is important. She's so important that magazines want to write about her and schools want to buy her computer programs, and people want her to come talk at big meetings. The accuracy and directness of his statement left everyone speechless. Out of the mouths of babes, as they say. My 7-year-old had just called out the entire dynamic that had been playing out here. The assumption that had led to my relegation to the plastic chairs and paper plates. David was the first to recover. You're absolutely right, Marcus. That wasn't fair. He looked at me, his expression serious. Sarah, I'm sorry. I should have said something when Jennifer suggested the kids' table. That was wrong. We have plenty of room at the main table, my mother added quickly. Sarah, please come sit with us. Bring your plate. But Marcus shook his head. I like sitting with Mom, he said. And she likes sitting with me. Right, Mom? I looked at my son, this wise little person who had just turned what could have been a moment of humiliation into something else entirely. He'd taken what was meant to diminish me and used it to reveal the truth about who I really was. Not just a struggling single mother who needed to get practical about her career, but a successful entrepreneur who was building something meaningful while also doing work she loved. Right, I said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. I like sitting with you, too. The conversation that followed was different from the one that had been happening before Marcus's presentation. Instead of discussing my limitations and poor choices, my family started asking questions about my business. Real questions, born of genuine curiosity rather than pity or judgment. How had I learned to code? What problems was my software solving? How many employees did I have? What were my plans? For expansion? Was I going to quit teaching? Did I need investors? Had I considered going public? The questions came faster than I could answer them, and I realized that this was what I'd been missing by keeping my success secret. Not the validation or the recognition exactly, but the opportunity to share something I was genuinely excited about with people I cared about. I told them about those first late nights learning to code, about the frustration with existing educational software that had driven me to build my own solutions. I explained how the business had grown organically, driven by word-of-mouth recommendations from teachers who had used my tools and found them genuinely helpful. I described the moment when I realized I might be onto something bigger than just solving my own classroom problems. The first contract, the first real revenue, the gradual realization that what I'd built had genuine market value. Jennifer, to her credit, asked thoughtful questions about the intersection of education and technology. She wanted to know how I balanced the needs of teachers with the demands of administrators, how I ensured that my software actually improved learning outcomes rather than just creating more work for educators. The book club friends, who had been silent through most of this conversation, started sharing their own experiences with educational technology in their children's schools. One of them mentioned that her daughter's teacher had been raving about a new classroom management system that had made communication between home and school so much easier. What was it called? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. EduFlow something, she said. EduFlow Solutions, I think. It was amazing. Instead of getting 3 different emails from 3 different systems, everything came through one portal that actually made sense. I smiled. That's my company. Her jaw dropped. You built that? My daughter's teacher says it's the best educational software she's ever used. She says it actually saves her time instead of creating more work. And there it was, the real validation, not from a magazine cover or a conference invitation, but from a teacher in a classroom somewhere who was doing her job a little bit better because of something I'd built. That was worth more than any amount of revenue or recognition. Marcus had finished reorganizing his folder and was now working on his second helping of mashed potatoes, apparently satisfied that he'd accomplished what he'd set out to do. He'd shared something he was proud of, corrected a misconception that bothered him, and ensured that his mom got the recognition he thought she deserved. As the dinner conversation continued around us, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 years ago, I'd been exactly what they'd assumed I was today. A struggling single mother, stretching every dollar, worried about the future. The difference was that I'd refused to accept that as my permanent reality. I'd seen problems that needed solving and figured out how to solve them. I'd learned new skills because I needed them, not because I had some grand plan to become an entrepreneur. I'd built something valuable by focusing on what teachers actually needed rather than what technology companies thought they needed. And I'd done it all while continuing to teach, because teaching wasn't something I was trying to escape from. It was the foundation everything else was built on. My understanding of classroom dynamics, my relationships with other educators, my insider's perspective on what actually worked and what didn't. All of that came from being in a classroom every day. The business success was wonderful, and the financial security it provided was life-changing. But the part I was most proud of was that I'd proven you could be both. You could care about education and care about profit. You could be a teacher and an entrepreneur. You could build wealth while building something that actually made the world a little bit better. Marcus looked up from his mashed potatoes and caught me watching him. Are you proud of me for sharing? He asked. So proud, I said. But I'm proud of you all the time. not just when you're sharing my accomplishments." He nodded seriously. "I know, but I wanted them to know that you're more than just my mom. You're also really good at business, and that's important too." And there it was again. That clarity that children sometimes have about things adults make complicated. I wasn't just a mom, or just a teacher, or just an entrepreneur. I was all of those things, and each one made the others stronger. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of questions and congratulations and apologies. My mother insisted on taking pictures of me with the Forbes magazine. David wanted to know if I needed help setting up retirement accounts or investment portfolios. Jennifer asked if I'd be willing to speak to her law firm about educational technology and compliance issues. By the time we were ready for dessert, the dynamic had shifted completely. Instead of being the struggling single mother who needed advice about getting practical, I was the successful entrepreneur who might have insights to share. Instead of sitting at the kids' table because there wasn't room for me with the important adults, I was being asked to move to the head of the table so everyone could hear my answers to their questions. But Marcus had been right earlier. I liked sitting with him. And more than that, I liked what sitting at the kids' table had taught me about assumptions and dignity and the danger of judging people based on what you think you know about their lives. So I stayed where I was, at the small table with the plastic plates and paper napkins, fielding questions from successful adults who were suddenly very interested in what the woman at the kids' table had to say. And Marcus sat beside me, proud and satisfied, occasionally adding his own commentary about why his mom was the smartest person he knew. It wasn't the Thanksgiving dinner I'd expected, but it was exactly the one I needed. The one where my 7-year-old reminded everyone in the room that people are more complex and capable than the stories we tell about them. The one where sitting at the kids' table turned out to be exactly where I belonged, not because I wasn't important enough for anywhere else, but because that's where the person who believed in me most was sitting. And sometimes, that's all the validation you really need. The weeks following that Thanksgiving dinner felt like living in an alternate universe. Word had spread through our extended family with the speed that only family gossip can achieve. And suddenly everyone wanted to reconnect with me. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years were calling to congratulate me. Aunts who had previously offered unsolicited advice about my life choices were now asking if I had any investment tips. The most surreal part was how quickly the narrative about me changed. The same relatives who had spent years treating me like a cautionary tale about the financial perils of single motherhood were now holding me up as an example of entrepreneurial success. It was as if my entire history had been rewritten overnight, and I wasn't sure how I felt about that. My cousin Rachel, who had once suggested I should consider getting remarried for financial stability, called to ask if I was hiring. My uncle, Tom, who used to make jokes about those who can't teach, wanted to know if I'd be interested in speaking at his Rotary Club about women in technology. Even my grandmother, who was 86 and had never used a computer in her life, had apparently been bragging to her bridge club about her granddaughter who was in the magazines. But it wasn't just family. The Forbes article had opened doors I hadn't even known existed. Educational conferences that had never responded to my speaker applications were suddenly reaching out with keynote invitations. Venture capital firms were calling to ask if I was interested in funding for expansion. Other entrepreneurs were requesting coffee meetings to pick my brain about bootstrapping a technology company. The attention was flattering and overwhelming in equal measure. For someone who had spent years flying under the radar, who had built her business quietly and deliberately, suddenly being in the spotlight felt strange and occasionally uncomfortable. I found myself second-guessing conversations, wondering if people were genuinely interested in what I had to say, or if they were just curious about the novelty of a teacher who had accidentally become a tech CEO. The most challenging part was navigating the changed expectations at school. My principal, Dr. Martinez, had been supportive when the Forbes article first came out, but as the weeks passed and more media attention followed, I could sense her growing concern about divided loyalties. How could I be fully committed to my students if I was also running $1 million business? It was a fair question, and one I'd been grappling with myself. The truth was that my teaching had actually improved since starting EduFlow Solutions. Understanding the business side of education had given me insights into administrative challenges and budget constraints that made me a more effective advocate for my students. Building software had sharpened my problem-solving skills and my ability to think systematically about complex issues. But I could understand Dr. Martinez's perspective. From the outside, it might look like I was using my teaching position as a testing ground for my business ideas, or that I was planning to abandon education as soon as my company became successful enough. Neither was true, but perception mattered, especially in a profession where dedication and selflessness were considered fundamental virtues. The conversation we finally had about it took place on a gray December afternoon, 2 weeks before winter break. She'd asked me to stay after school, and I knew from her tone that this wasn't going to be a casual chat about lesson plans or parent conferences. "Sarah," she began, settling into the chair across from my desk, "I want to start by saying how proud we all are of your success. What you've accomplished is truly remarkable, and it reflects well on our entire school community." I waited for the but that I could hear coming. "But I need to understand your intentions moving forward. Are you planning to continue teaching? Because if you're not, I need to know so I can plan accordingly for next year's staffing." It was a reasonable request, delivered in Dr. Martinez's characteristic direct but kind manner. She'd been a good principal to work for, supportive of innovative teaching methods and protective of her staff's time and energy. She deserved an honest answer. "I love teaching," I said, which was true. "And I love what I've built with EduFlow Solutions. I don't want to choose between them if I don't have to." She nodded thoughtfully. "But practically speaking, how long can you maintain both? Running $1 million company isn't exactly a part-time commitment, and teaching done well isn't either." That was the crux of the issue. For the past 3 years, I'd been managing both by working essentially 2 full-time jobs, teaching during the day, building software, and managing business operations at night and on weekends. It had been sustainable when EduFlow Solutions was small, when I could handle customer support emails during my planning period and do development work after Marcus went to bed. But the company had grown beyond what one person could manage alone. I now had contracts with 63 school districts across 7 states. I'd hired 3 part-time developers and a customer service representative, but I was still the primary point of contact for sales, still responsible for product development decisions, still the face of the company for media interviews and conference presentations. Something was going to have to give, and we both knew it. "What if I reduced my teaching load?" I asked. "Maybe half-time, or just morning classes? I could still be in the classroom, still work with students, but have more flexibility to manage the business side." Dr. Martinez considered this. "It's possible. We've done part-time arrangements before for teachers in unique circumstances. But I'll be honest with you, Sarah. There are people in the district who are already questioning whether you're truly committed to education, given your business success. A reduced schedule might reinforce those concerns." There it was again, the assumption that caring about profit somehow diminished my dedication to students. The idea that financial success and educational passion were mutually exclusive. It was frustrating, but not surprising. I'd encountered this attitude before, in small ways, from colleagues who made comments about those who leave the classroom for bigger paychecks, or administrators who viewed any outside business activity with suspicion. "What do you think?" I asked. "Do you question my commitment?" She was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the empty playground where maintenance crews were setting up holiday decorations. "I think you're one of the most innovative and effective teachers I've ever worked with," she said finally. "Your students consistently perform above district averages. Their parents rave about your communication and creativity, And you volunteered for every committee and initiative. I've asked you to join. If that's not commitment, I don't know what is." The tension in my shoulders eased slightly. "But," she continued, "I also think you're trying to do too much. I can see the exhaustion in your eyes, Sarah. You're running on adrenaline and caffeine, and that's not sustainable long term. Something's got to give, and I'd rather you make that choice deliberately than have it made for you by burnout or stress." She was right, of course. I was exhausted. The past few months had been a whirlwind of media interviews, business meetings, conference calls, and customer support issues, all squeezed into the margins around my teaching responsibilities. I was staying up until midnight most nights, answering emails and reviewing code, then getting up at 5:30 to prepare lessons and grade papers before school. The success was exhilarating, but it was also overwhelming. Every day brought new opportunities, new challenges, new decisions that felt both exciting and terrifying. Should I hire more employees? Should I expand into new markets? Should I accept the speaking engagement in California or the consulting contract with the education technology company in Texas? And underneath all of that was the constant pressure of imposter syndrome. The voice in my head that whispered I was just a small-town teacher who had gotten lucky, that I didn't really belong in boardrooms and conference centers, that eventually someone would figure out I didn't know what I was doing. "I need to think about it," I told Dr. Martinez. "Can I have until after winter break to decide?" She nodded. "Of course. But Sarah, whatever you decide, make sure it's what you really want, not what you think you should want or what other people expect from you." That evening, I sat in my home office staring at the framed Forbes cover on my wall. Marcus was at his father's house for the weekend. Lily was at a sleepover, and the apartment was unusually quiet. No urgent emails demanding immediate attention. No lesson plans that needed finishing. No conference calls scheduled with West Coast clients. Just me and the weight of a decision that felt much bigger than choosing between teaching and business. It felt like choosing between different versions of myself, different ideas about success and purpose, and what kind of life I wanted to build. I thought about the teacher I'd been 3 years ago, before EduFlow Solutions existed. Passionate about education, but constantly stressed about money. Creative in the classroom, but frustrated by the limitations of existing technology. Dedicated to my students, but sometimes resentful of a system that seemed to value teachers' sacrifice more than their expertise. That version of me had been happy in some ways, but she'd also been constrained. Limited by resources and circumstances and other people's assumptions about what teachers could and couldn't do. Building a business hadn't just changed my financial situation. It had changed how I saw myself and what I believed was possible. But I also thought about what I might lose if I stepped away from the classroom entirely. The daily interaction with students, the satisfaction of watching understanding dawn on a child's face, the sense of being part of something larger than profit margins and market share. Teaching wasn't just my profession, it was part of my identity, woven into how I understood my place in the world. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. "Mom, Dad says you might stop being a teacher. Is that true?" Even from 50 miles away, my 7-year-old had managed to identify the heart of my dilemma. I texted back, "I'm thinking about different options. What do you think I should do?" His response came quickly. "I think you should do what makes you happy. But I like when you tell me stories about your students." Out of the mouths of babes, again. Marcus had a gift for cutting through complexity to reach simple truths. I did like telling him stories about my students. I liked being able to share the funny things they said, the breakthrough moments when struggling readers finally found their confidence, the creative projects that surprised me with their insight and originality. Those stories were part of how I made sense of my days, part of how I connected my work to something meaningful beyond paychecks and performance metrics. If I left teaching entirely, what stories would I tell Marcus about my days? Tales of software, development and customer acquisition, updates on revenue projections and market penetration. Those things were important and satisfying in their own way, but they didn't feed my soul the way teaching did. My laptop chimed with an email notification. Another interview request, this one from a podcast about women entrepreneurs. The subject line promised to reach an engaged audience of ambitious professionals seeking inspiration and actionable insights. I stared at the email for a long time before deleting it. The next morning, I called Dr. Martinez and asked if we could meet again. This time, I came prepared with a proposal. I want to stay in teaching, I said, but I also want to grow EduFlow Solutions. What if we could find a way to make those goals support each other instead of competing? She raised an eyebrow. What did you have in mind? A partnership, I said. The district has been talking about updating its technology infrastructure, right? What if EduFlow Solutions provided those services at cost, in exchange for allowing me to use our schools as a research and development laboratory? I could maintain a reduced teaching schedule, but I'd also be working directly with district administration to implement and refine educational technology solutions. It was an ambitious idea, one that had come to me during a sleepless night, of trying to figure out how to honor both sides of my professional identity. Instead of seeing my business and my teaching as conflicting commitments, what if they could be integrated in a way that strengthened both? Dr. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. You're talking about creating a new kind of position, she said finally. Part teacher, part technology consultant, part researcher. Exactly. I'd still be in classrooms, still working directly with students and teachers. But I'd also be helping the district navigate the complex world of educational technology, making sure we're investing in tools that actually improve learning instead of just looking impressive in budget presentations. She leaned back in her chair, considering. It's unconventional. I'd have to run it by the superintendent and the school board. There would be questions about conflicts of interest, about whether you're being compensated fairly for consulting work, about how to evaluate your performance in a hybrid role. I know it's complicated, I said, but I think it could work, and I think it could benefit everyone involved. The district gets access to high-quality technology support and expertise. I get to maintain my connection to classroom teaching while growing my business. Students and teachers get better tools and more thoughtful implementation. What I didn't say, but what we both understood, was that this arrangement would also help legitimize my business in the eyes of educators who were skeptical of for-profit companies working in schools. If I remained a practicing teacher, if I kept one foot firmly planted in the classroom, it would be harder to dismiss EduFlow Solutions as just another tech company trying to profit from education. Dr. Martinez asked thoughtful questions about logistics and timelines, about how the arrangement would work practically, and what safeguards would need to be in place to protect both the district's interests and my own. By the end of our conversation, she was cautiously optimistic. "Let me take this to the superintendent," she said. "I can't make any promises, but I think there might be interest. The district has been struggling with technology implementation for years, and having someone with your expertise and understanding of education could be exactly what we need." That afternoon, I found myself thinking about the path that had brought me to this point. 3 years ago, I'd been a frustrated teacher trying to solve problems in my own classroom. I'd never imagined that those late-night coding sessions would lead to a business featured in Forbes magazine, or that the simple desire to make my job easier would create opportunities I'd never dreamed of. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the best innovations came not from grand plans or strategic visions, but from people who were close enough to problems to understand them deeply and stubborn enough to keep working until they found solutions. I thought about Marcus and his proud presentation at Thanksgiving dinner, the way he'd refused to let my accomplishments be diminished or dismissed. He'd understood instinctively that I didn't have to choose between being a good teacher and being a successful entrepreneur, that those identities could coexist and strengthen each other. Maybe it was time to stop thinking about my career in terms of either-or choices and start thinking about how to build something entirely new. Something that honored both my passion for education and my aptitude for business. Something that proved you didn't have to abandon your values to achieve financial success or sacrifice your expertise to build wealth. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was the superintendent's office, asking if I could come in for a meeting the following week. Dr. Martinez had clearly moved quickly on our conversation. "We're very interested in exploring this partnership idea," the administrative assistant said. "Dr. Williams would like to discuss the details with you and potentially present it to the school board at next month's meeting." I hung up feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness that I recognized from every major decision I'd made in the past 3 years. The feeling of standing at the edge of something new and uncertain, knowing that the safe choice would be to stay where I was, but also knowing that the only way to find out what was possible was to take the leap. That evening, when Marcus called from his father's house, I told him about my conversation with Dr. Martinez and the upcoming meeting with the superintendent. "So you're going to keep being a teacher and keep running your company?" he asked. "Maybe," I said, "if I can figure out how to make it work." "You'll figure it out," he said with the confidence of someone who had never seen me fail at something I was determined to do. "You're really good at solving problems." And maybe he was right. Maybe the same skills that had helped me build a successful business from nothing could help me create a new kind of career that didn't fit neatly into existing categories. Maybe being at the kids' table at Thanksgiving had been preparation for this moment, for learning how to make my own space when the established options didn't fit. I spent the rest of the weekend preparing for the meeting with the superintendent, researching other districts that had created innovative partnerships with educational technology companies, drafting proposals and budget projections and implementation timelines. But underneath all the planning and preparation was a growing sense of certainty. This was what I wanted to build. Not just a business or a career, but a new way of thinking about the relationship between education and entrepreneurship. A model that proved you could care about both students and profit margins, that showed expertise and innovation could coexist with dedication and service. It wouldn't be easy. There would be skeptics and bureaucratic obstacles and moments of doubt. But then again, nothing worthwhile ever was easy. And if a small-town teacher could build $1 million business by solving problems she cared about, maybe she could also help reimagine what it meant to be an educator in the 21st century. The week passed quickly, filled with the usual rhythms of teaching and the unusual excitement of preparing for a meeting that could change everything. My students seemed to sense that something significant was happening, asking if I was okay, when they caught me staring out the window during lunch or staying after school to perfect my presentation slides. On Friday afternoon, as I was packing up my classroom for the weekend, Emma Rodriguez, one of my 5th graders, approached my desk. With the serious expression she wore when asking important questions, "Mrs. Wilson," she said, "my mom read about you in that magazine. She says you're famous now." "Not famous exactly," I said. "Just lucky enough to have something I built get some attention." Emma considered this. "Are you going to stop being our teacher?" It was the question I'd been dreading from my students, the one that got to the heart of my own fears about divided loyalties and competing commitments. How do you explain to an 11-year-old that success brings choices, and that choices sometimes feel like losses even when they're gains? "I'm going to try very hard to keep being a teacher," I said, "because I love teaching and I love working with students like you. But I might also do some other things too, to help make schools better for everyone." She nodded solemnly. "My mom says you can do anything you want now because you're rich." I laughed. Being successful gives you more options, but it doesn't change who you are inside. I'm still the same person I was before the magazine article. "Good," Emma said, "because you're a really good teacher, and we need good teachers." And there, it was, the reminder I needed about what really mattered. Not the magazine covers or the conference invitations or the venture capital inquiries, but the daily work of helping children learn and grow and discover what they're capable of achieving. Whatever happened in my meeting with the superintendent, whatever new arrangements emerged from this period of transition and possibility that would remain the center of everything, the knowledge that teaching wasn't just what I did for a living, but who I was at the deepest level. The rest would be details to figure out, obstacles to overcome, opportunities to explore. But the core mission would remain unchanged, helping people learn, solve problems, and realize their potential. Whether those people were fifth graders struggling with fractions or school administrators trying to navigate educational technology, the fundamental purpose was the same. As I walked to my car that afternoon, I felt more confident about the upcoming meeting and the decisions ahead. Not because I had all the answers, but because I was clear about the questions that mattered most. Not, how can I make the most money? Or, how can I become more famous? But how can I use my skills and resources to make the biggest positive impact? That was a question worth building a career around, whatever form that career might ultimately take. The morning of my meeting with Superintendent Williams dawned crisp and clear, the kind of January day that makes you believe anything is possible. I'd spent the weekend refining my proposal, running through potential questions and objections, and trying to project the kind of confidence that I hoped I actually felt. The district office building was a low-slung brick structure from the 1970s, all earth tones and small windows that seemed designed to filter out optimism. I'd been here dozens of times over the years for curriculum meetings and professional development sessions, but walking through those glass doors that morning felt different. I wasn't just another teacher being summoned for administrative business. I was an entrepreneur proposing a partnership that could change how the district approached educational technology. Dr. Williams was waiting in her office, along with Dr. Martinez and someone I didn't recognize, a woman in her 40s wearing a sharp navy suit and carrying a tablet. She introduced herself as Lisa Chen, the district's technology coordinator, a position I hadn't known existed until that moment. "Sarah?" Dr. Williams began after we'd settled around her conference table. "Dr. Martinez has told me about your proposal, and frankly, it's exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need, but I'll be honest with you, there are complications we need to address." She pulled out a folder thick with documents. "We've been researching your company since our conversation last week. EduFlow Solutions has an impressive track record, and your client testimonials are remarkable. But we need to understand how this partnership would work within district policies and state regulations." Lisa Chen leaned forward. "The main concern is conflict of interest. You'd essentially be both vendor and employee, which creates potential ethical and legal issues. We need to structure this carefully to protect both parties." I'd anticipated this concern and come prepared with research on similar arrangements in other districts. I've looked at models from 3 other states where districts have created hybrid positions for teacher entrepreneurs. The key is transparency and proper oversight. I'd be willing to work with reduced compensation for my consulting role, with clear boundaries about when I'm acting as a district employee versus a business owner. Dr. Williams nodded thoughtfully. "What about your other clients? Would this partnership create conflicts with your existing contracts?" "Actually, it would strengthen them," I said. "Having ongoing classroom experience keeps me connected to the real challenges teachers face. My other clients would benefit from insights gained through our partnership, and I'd be happy to share successful implementation strategies from other districts as long as it doesn't violate confidentiality agreements." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, covering everything from liability insurance to performance evaluation metrics. They asked detailed questions about my development process, my customer support structure, and my plans for scaling the business. Lisa Chen wanted to understand the technical specifications of my software, while Dr. Martinez focused on pedagogical implications and classroom integration. What impressed me most was their seriousness about making it work. These weren't administrators, going through the motions of considering an unusual proposal. They were genuinely wrestling with how to create something new and beneficial for everyone involved. "There's another issue we need to discuss," Dr. Williams said as we neared the end of the meeting. "Media attention. Your Forbes feature has generated significant interest in our district. We've had calls from other publications wanting to do follow-up stories, and the school board is concerned about becoming a testing ground for your business experiments." I felt my stomach tighten. I understand the concern, but I want to be clear about my intentions. This isn't about using the district for publicity or product development. It's about creating a sustainable model for keeping experienced educators in classrooms while also encouraging innovation. "We believe that," Dr. Martinez said, "but we need to manage expectations carefully. If this partnership succeeds, there will be attention from other districts, other entrepreneurs, other media outlets. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on the immediate challenges of balancing teaching and business that I hadn't fully considered the long-term implications of success. If our hybrid model worked, if it proved that educators could be entrepreneurs without abandoning their commitment to students, it could indeed attract significant attention. "I think transparency is our best protection," I said finally. "If we're clear about our goals, our methods, and our results, if we document everything carefully and share both successes and failures honestly, then scrutiny becomes accountability rather than threat." Lisa Chen was taking notes on her tablet. "We'd want to establish clear metrics for success: student achievement data, teacher satisfaction surveys, technology adoption rates, cost-benefit analysis. If this partnership works, we want evidence. If it doesn't, we want to know quickly so we can make adjustments." After they walked me to the parking lot, promising a decision within 2 weeks, I sat in my car for several minutes processing what had just happened. The meeting had gone better than I'd hoped, but it had also revealed complexities I hadn't fully anticipated. Creating something new was always more complicated than improving something that already existed. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "How did your big meeting go?" Even from school, my son was keeping track of the important events in my life, offering support in his 7-year-old way. "I think it went well," I texted back. "They're going to think about it and let me know. I hope they say yes. You would be really good at helping schools with computer stuff." His confidence in me was both touching and motivating. Marcus had never seen me fail at something I was determined to do, which meant he approached my challenges with an optimism that sometimes exceeded my own. But maybe that was exactly what I needed: someone who believed in my capabilities without reservation. The 2 weeks of waiting stretched like a month. I threw myself into teaching with renewed energy, partly to distract myself from anxiety about the decision, and partly to remind myself why I loved being in the classroom. My students were working on a unit about innovation and problem solving, which felt appropriately meta given my own situation. We studied inventors and entrepreneurs who had changed the world by identifying problems others had overlooked or accepted as permanent. Thomas Edison and his systematic approach to invention. Madam C.J. Walker and her hair care business empire. Steve Jobs and his vision for personal computing. The kids were fascinated by stories of people who had started with nothing but ideas and persistence. "Mrs. Wilson," asked James, one of my more precocious students, "are you like those inventors? Because my mom says you invented computer programs for schools." I paused in my explanation of Edison's laboratory system. I wouldn't call myself an inventor exactly, but I did see problems that needed solving and figured out ways to solve them, just like you're learning to do with our science projects. Sarah, who was usually quiet during class discussions, raised her hand. "My sister goes to high school now, and she says their computer systems are really confusing. Like, they have to use different websites for everything, and some of them don't work on phones." That's exactly the kind of problem I was trying to solve, I said. Sometimes the best innovations come from people who use systems every day and notice what doesn't work well. The conversation that followed was one of those magical classroom moments when curriculum and real life intersect perfectly. The students peppered me with questions about business and technology and problem solving, connecting our lesson objectives to something concrete and personal. Several of them started brainstorming their own inventions, identifying problems in their daily lives that might have solutions. What if there was an app that helped you remember to feed your goldfish? Suggested Maria. Or something that made sure you grabbed your homework before leaving for school? Added David. What about a program that helped teachers grade papers faster so they could spend more time helping students? Asked Emma, ever thoughtful about the adults in her life. I wrote their ideas on the board, encouraging them to think through the practical challenges of turning problems into solutions. How would you build it? Who would use it? What would make it better than existing options? How would you convince people to try it? Without realizing it, I was teaching them the fundamentals of entrepreneurship through the lens of invention and innovation, and they were responding with the kind of engagement and excitement that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with teaching in the first place. That afternoon, as I was cleaning the whiteboard and organizing materials for the next day, Dr. Martinez appeared in my doorway with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Sarah, do you have a few minutes?" My heart started racing. 2 weeks had passed since my meeting with the superintendent, and I'd been checking my email obsessively for any word about their decision. Dr. Martinez's careful neutrality could mean anything. She closed the classroom door behind her and sat down across from my desk. "I just came from a school board meeting," she said. "They voted on your proposal." I held my breath. "It was unanimous," she continued, and I could see her trying not to smile. "They approved the partnership, with conditions, of course, and a 1-year trial period, but they're excited about moving forward." The relief that flooded through me was overwhelming. I'd been more anxious about the decision than I'd admitted to myself, more invested in making this hybrid model work than I'd fully recognized. "What are the conditions?" I asked. "Monthly progress reports, quarterly reviews with the technology committee, clear documentation of all business activities that involve district resources, and you'll need to complete additional training in educational leadership and administration." "That's completely reasonable," I said. "What about the teaching component?" 60% teaching load, 40% technology consultation and training. You'll keep your current classroom but reduce from 6 sections to 4. The other, teachers will pick up the additional sections, with some compensation from the technology budget. It was better than I'd hoped for. Enough teaching to maintain my connection to students and classroom practice. Enough consulting time to meaningfully support the district's technology initiatives and grow my business expertise. "There's one more thing," Dr. Martinez said. "The board wants to document this partnership carefully. They're interested in potentially presenting it as a model for other districts, maybe even publishing case studies about innovative approaches to teacher retention and technology integration." The implications of that hit me immediately. If this worked, if our hybrid model proved successful, it could indeed attract the kind of attention Dr. Williams had warned me about. Other districts might want to replicate our approach. Educational researchers might want to study our outcomes. Media outlets might want to tell our story. "Are you comfortable with that level of visibility?" Dr. Martinez asked, echoing the superintendent's earlier concern. I thought about Marcus and his proud presentation at Thanksgiving dinner, about his matter-of-fact confidence that his mom could handle any challenge. I thought about the students in my classroom who were learning to see problems as opportunities for innovation. I thought about all the teachers in districts across the country who might be struggling with the same tensions between passion and practicality that I'd been navigating. "I think visibility could be a good thing," I said finally. "If we're successful, other people should be able to learn from what we've done. And if we're not successful, they should be able to learn from our mistakes. Dr. Martinez smiled fully now. I was hoping you'd say that. Because honestly, Sarah, I think you're going to change how people think about teaching careers. This partnership isn't just about solving our district's technology problems. It's about proving that educators can be innovators and entrepreneurs without sacrificing their commitment to students. That evening, I called Marcus to share the news. He was at his father's house again, but he answered on the first ring like he'd been waiting for my call. They said yes, I told him. I get to keep teaching and help the school district with computer stuff. I knew they would, he said with characteristic confidence, because you're really good at both things. How was your day? I asked, wanting to shift the focus back to him. Good. We learned about fractions and math, and I helped Tommy understand how to add them. I think I might want to be a teacher someday too. The comment caught me off guard. Marcus had mentioned various career aspirations over the years. Astronaut, veterinarian, professional soccer player. But teacher was new. What made you think about teaching? I asked. Well, you love being a teacher, and you're also really successful with your business. So maybe I could do both things too. Like, maybe I could teach kids about science and also invent new science stuff. His logic was so clear, so unencumbered by the assumptions that had made my own path feel complicated and uncertain. To Marcus, being a teacher entrepreneur wasn't unusual or problematic. It was simply an interesting combination of things his mom was good at, things he might want to try himself someday. I think that would be amazing, I said. The world needs people who can teach and innovate and solve problems. Yeah, he agreed. And besides, you've already figured out how to do it, so I can just learn from you. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen looking at the framed Forbes cover that Marcus had insisted I display prominently. 6 months ago, that recognition had felt like validation of something I'd built in secret. Tonight, it felt like the beginning of something much bigger. The next few weeks flew by in a blur of planning meetings and curriculum adjustments. The district's technology committee wanted detailed proposals for infrastructure improvements and software integration. My fellow teachers needed briefings on how the partnership would affect their workloads and classroom assignments. Parents required explanation about changes to their children's schedules and teacher assignments. Each conversation reinforced my conviction that transparency was crucial to success. I explained my background and qualifications honestly, acknowledged the experimental nature of our arrangement, and invited questions and feedback at every stage. Some parents were skeptical, wondering if a part-time teacher could provide the same quality of instruction. Some colleagues worried about precedent and fairness, questioning whether successful teachers should receive special accommodations. But mostly, people were supportive and curious. They wanted to understand how the partnership would work, how it might benefit students, and whether it could be replicated elsewhere. The questions were thoughtful and practical, focused on outcomes rather than personalities. The local newspaper ran a feature story about our innovative arrangement, framing it as part of a broader trend toward hybrid careers and flexible work arrangements. The reporter interviewed Dr. Williams, Dr. Martinez, and several parents, painting a picture of a forward-thinking district willing to experiment with new models for attracting and retaining talented educators. Sarah Wilson represents the kind of innovative thinking we need in education, Dr. Williams was quoted as saying. She's proving that you can be deeply committed to student learning while also bringing entrepreneurial energy to educational challenges. The article included quotes from parents praising my teaching effectiveness and expressing optimism about the technology improvements I'd help implement. Even the few skeptical voices were measured and constructive, focusing on concerns about accountability and sustainability rather than personal attacks. Reading the article, I realized that the narrative about my career had shifted again. 6 months ago, I'd been the struggling single mother who needed practical advice about her future. 3 months ago, I'd been the surprising success story, the teacher who'd accidentally built a business. Now I was the educational innovator, the entrepreneur educator pioneering new models for 21st century careers. Each version contained some truth, but none captured the full complexity of the journey. The real story wasn't about transformation from one identity to another, but about integration of multiple identities that had always coexisted. I'd always been entrepreneurial, even when my innovations were limited to classroom management strategies and creative lesson plans. I'd always been business-minded, even when my budget was measured in dozens rather than thousands of dollars. The Forbes feature hadn't created my entrepreneurial identity. It had simply made it visible and validated. The district partnership wasn't changing my commitment to education. It was providing a structure for expressing that commitment more broadly and effectively. But perhaps most importantly, none of these developments had altered my relationship with Marcus or my fundamental priorities as a parent. If anything, showing him that adults could grow and change and create new opportunities had enriched our conversations about his own future possibilities. The day my new schedule officially began, I woke up feeling energized rather than anxious. The morning teaching block felt familiar and comfortable, while the afternoon consultation meetings offered intellectual challenges that stretched my thinking in productive directions. Instead of feeling torn between competing demands, I felt like I was finally using all of my capabilities in service of connected goals. My first major project involved evaluating and improving the district's student information system, which teachers had been complaining about for years. The existing platform was slow, confusing, and required multiple logins for basic functions. Parents struggled to access their children's grades and assignments. Administrative staff spent hours on tasks that should have taken minutes. Working with Lisa Chen and a committee of teachers and parents, I conducted a comprehensive needs assessment and developed specifications for a more integrated solution. We researched existing platforms, solicited proposals from vendors, and designed pilot programs to test promising options. The process was complex and occasionally frustrating, involving stakeholders with different priorities and perspectives. Teachers wanted simplicity and speed. Administrators needed comprehensive reporting capabilities. Parents demanded transparency and user-friendly interfaces. The school board focused on cost-effectiveness and long-term sustainability. But navigating these competing demands was exactly the kind of challenge I thrived on. My background in both education and technology allowed me to translate between groups, finding solutions that addressed multiple needs simultaneously. My classroom experience gave me credibility with teachers, while my business success earned respect from administrators and board members. After 3 months of evaluation and testing, we implemented a new integrated platform that reduced login requirements from 5 different systems to 1, cut administrative processing time by 40%, and increased parent engagement with student progress monitoring by 60%. Teacher satisfaction surveys showed marked improvement, and student achievement data suggested that easier access to academic information was helping families provide more targeted support at home. The success of the student information system project led to additional requests for technology consultation. Could I evaluate our online learning platforms? Could I help design professional development programs for educational technology integration? Could I consult on the district's 5-year technology strategic plan? Each project reinforced my conviction that effective educational technology required deep understanding of both pedagogy and practical classroom dynamics. Too many edtech companies developed products in isolation from actual teaching and learning contexts, creating tools that looked impressive in demonstrations but proved clunky and ineffective in daily use. My hybrid role allowed me to bridge that gap, ensuring that technology investments actually supported educational goals, rather than creating additional obstacles for teachers and students. And the insights I gained from these consulting projects strengthened my own software development, helping EduFlow Solutions create products that addressed real needs identified through systematic assessment, rather than assumptions about what schools might want. By spring, word of our partnership had spread beyond the local district. I received invitations to present at educational technology conferences, speaking not just about EduFlow solutions, but about the broader concept of teacher-entrepreneur hybrid roles. The presentations were well received, generating interest from other districts considering similar arrangements, and from teachers exploring entrepreneurial opportunities within education. One particularly memorable conference was in Denver, where I spoke to an audience of nearly 400 educators, administrators, and technology professionals. The topic was Bridging the Gap: How Teacher Entrepreneurs Can Transform Educational Technology, and the response was overwhelming. During the question and answer session, a middle school principal from Colorado asked, "How do you maintain credibility with teachers who might be skeptical of profit motives in education?" "By staying in the classroom," I replied. "My teaching load keeps me connected to daily realities that affect both students and teachers. When I recommend a technology solution, it's not because it will generate revenue for my company, but because I've tested it in my own classroom and seen positive results. Profit and purpose aren't mutually exclusive if you're transparent about both." A high school computer science teacher from Arizona wanted to know about scalability. Could this model work for teachers in different subjects or grade levels? "Absolutely," I said. "The specific business focus might vary. Maybe a math teacher develops educational games, or a science teacher creates laboratory management software, but the fundamental principle remains the same. Teachers have deep expertise in learning and instruction that can inform innovation in ways that benefit both their own students and the broader educational community." After my presentation, I was approached by representatives from 3 different districts interested in exploring partnerships with teacher entrepreneurs. 2 venture capital firms wanted to discuss funding opportunities for educator-founded companies. A publisher asked if I'd be interested in writing a book about my experience. The attention was flattering and occasionally overwhelming, but it also confirmed that our hybrid model was addressing a genuine need in the education sector. Too many talented teachers were leaving the profession because they felt constrained by limited career advancement opportunities and inadequate compensation. Too many educational innovations were failing because they were developed by people who lacked practical classroom experience. Our partnership offered a potential solution to both problems, creating pathways for teacher leadership and ensuring that innovation remained grounded in educational reality. Flying home from Denver, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. 18 months ago, I'd been sitting at a plastic kids' table, listening to relatives discuss my poor life choices and limited prospects. Today, I was returning from a national conference where hundreds of educators had sought my insights on innovative career models and educational technology. The external transformation was remarkable, but the internal changes felt even more significant. I'd learned to see constraints as creative challenges rather than permanent limitations. I'd discovered that expertise in one area could inform innovation in another, that teaching skills translated surprisingly well to entrepreneurship and business development. Most importantly, I'd realized that success wasn't about choosing between competing identities or values, but about finding ways to integrate them authentically and productively. I didn't have to stop being a teacher to become an entrepreneur, or abandon my entrepreneurial instincts to remain committed to education. The plane descended through clouds toward home, and I could see the familiar grid of streets and buildings that contained my life. The school where I taught, the apartment where I lived with Marcus and Lily, the community that had shaped my understanding of what was possible for someone with my background and circumstances. Tomorrow, I'd be back in my classroom, helping 5th graders understand fractions and preparing them for their science fair projects. In the afternoon, I'd meet with the district's curriculum committee to discuss technology integration strategies for the upcoming school year. In the evening, I'd review customer feedback for EduFlow solutions and plan improvements for our next software update. It was exactly the kind of complex, multifaceted life I'd always wanted, but never quite believed was achievable. And it had all started with the simple decision to solve problems I cared about, using skills I could develop and resources I could access. As Marcus liked to say, I was really good at solving problems. It had just taken me a while to realize that the biggest problem I needed to solve was my own assumption about what kinds of solutions were possible. 2 years have passed since that Thanksgiving dinner that changed everything, and I'm writing this from my new home office in Maple Heights, looking out at the backyard where Marcus is teaching his younger cousin how to throw a football. The key. House is everything I'd hoped it would be when I signed those papers 18 months ago. But more than that, it's become a symbol of what's possible when you refuse to let other people's assumptions define your limits. This morning, Marcus woke me up by bursting into my bedroom with his tablet, practically vibrating with excitement. Mom, look at this. He'd found an article online about innovative education partnerships, and there was our district prominently, featured as a model for other communities to follow. The headline read, "How One School District Revolutionized Teacher Retention Through Entrepreneurial Partnerships." And my photo was right there alongside Dr. Williams and several other educators who had started businesses while maintaining their classroom roles. "We're famous again," Marcus announced with the matter-of-fact pride that had become his signature response to media attention. At 9 years old, he'd grown accustomed to his mom being interviewed by reporters and invited to speak at conferences. It was simply part of his normal, the way some kids grow up knowing their parents are doctors or lawyers or shop owners. The article described how our initial pilot program had expanded into a comprehensive initiative called the Teacher Innovation Fellowship, which now supported 12 educator entrepreneurs across the district. Mathematics teacher Roberto Sanchez had developed adaptive learning software for students with learning differences. Art teacher Michelle Porter had created a platform for virtual museum field trips. Even our librarian, Quiet Mrs. Chen, had launched a literacy app that helped parents support their children's reading development at home. Each fellowship recipient maintained at least 50% teaching responsibilities while pursuing their business ventures, with district support for professional development, legal guidance, and technology resources. The program had become so successful that we were fielding inquiries from districts in 15 states, and the state education department was considering legislation to formalize similar partnerships statewide. Reading the article, I felt a familiar mixture of pride and disbelief. Had we really accomplished all of this in just 2 years? Had the conversation that started with me sitting at a kid's table really led to systemic change that was now being studied and replicated across the country? Marcus settled next to me on the couch, reading over my shoulder with the focused attention he brought to anything involving his family. "It says here that you've helped create 47 new jobs and that student test scores in participating schools have improved by an average of 12%. That's really good, right?" "It's very good," I agreed, ruffling his hair. "But the numbers don't tell the whole story. The most important part is that teachers are staying in education instead of leaving for other careers. We're keeping experienced educators in classrooms while also encouraging innovation." The retention statistics were indeed remarkable. Before the Teacher Innovation Fellowship program, our district was losing approximately 25% of its teaching staff every year, with many citing limited career advancement opportunities and inadequate compensation as primary factors. This year, that number had dropped to 8%, and exit interviews revealed that departing teachers were primarily leaving for family reasons or retirement rather than professional dissatisfaction. More significantly, we were attracting experienced educators from other districts who were drawn by the opportunity to pursue entrepreneurial interests while maintaining their classroom connections. Applications for teaching positions had increased by 40%, and the quality of candidates had improved dramatically. But beyond the statistics and media coverage, what I treasured most were the smaller, more personal transformations I witnessed daily. Roberto Sanchez, whose adaptive learning software had helped hundreds of students with dyslexia and ADHD, had told me just last week that he'd never imagined he could impact education beyond his own classroom. Michelle Porter's virtual museum platform was being used by schools in rural areas that couldn't afford traditional field trips, bringing art and culture to students who might never have had those experiences otherwise. These were educators who had always been innovative and entrepreneurial in their teaching, but who had never had the support or framework to scale their ideas beyond individual classrooms. The fellowship program hadn't created their creativity or business instincts. It had simply provided channels for those qualities to flourish and reach broader audiences. My own company, EduFlow Solutions, had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. During those early days of late-night coding and weekend testing, we now served over 200 school districts across 12 states with annual revenue exceeding $3 million. I'd hired 8 full-time employees, including 2 other teachers who had transitioned to full-time educational technology development. But perhaps more importantly, EduFlow Solutions had become a laboratory for testing educational innovations in real classroom settings before bringing them to market. Every product we developed was piloted in our partner district first, refined, based on teacher and student feedback, and then released only after we were confident it would genuinely improve learning outcomes. This approach had earned us a reputation for creating educational technology that actually worked as promised, that enhanced rather than complicated the teaching and learning process. Our customer retention rate was 94%, and our referral rate was even higher, as satisfied districts recommended our solutions to their colleagues in other communities. The business success had been gratifying, but it had never become the primary motivation. What drove me every morning was the knowledge that the tools we were building were helping teachers teach more effectively and students learn more successfully. Revenue was validation that we were creating genuine value, not an end goal in itself. My teaching had evolved as well, though I still spent 3 mornings a week in my 5th grade classroom. The students I worked with now were part of an innovative pilot program that integrated entrepreneurship education with traditional academic subjects. They learned mathematics through business planning exercises, developed writing skills by creating marketing materials for imaginary companies, and explored science concepts by designing solutions to real-world problems. The approach was wildly popular with students who thrived on the practical applications and creative challenges. More importantly, it was preparing them for a world where traditional career paths were becoming less common and entrepreneurial thinking was increasingly valuable regardless of chosen profession. Last month, one of my students, 11-year-old Sophia Ramirez, had presented her idea for a mobile app that would help elderly people connect with teenage volunteers for technology support. Her presentation to a panel of local business leaders was so polished and thoughtful that 2 different organizations offered to help her develop a pilot program. Sophia's confidence and articulation skills had grown dramatically over the school year, and she was already talking about studying business and computer science in college. These were the moments that reminded me why I'd fought so hard to maintain my classroom connections even as my business responsibilities expanded. The daily interaction with students kept me grounded in the human dimension of education, the reminder that behind every data point and technology solution were individual children with unique dreams and challenges and potential. The bell rang, in the distance, calling students back from recess, and I realized I'd been lost in thought longer than intended. Marcus had moved on to playing a game on his tablet, but he looked up when I started gathering my materials for the afternoon's district leadership meeting. "Are you nervous about your big presentation today?" he asked. The district was considering a major expansion of the Teacher Innovation Fellowship program, potentially tripling the number of participants and adding support for educators interested in social entrepreneurship and community development projects. "A little," I admitted. "It's a big decision that could affect a lot of people." "You'll do great," Marcus said with characteristic confidence. "You always figure out how to make good things happen." His faith in me was both humbling and motivating. Over the past 2 years, Marcus had watched me navigate challenges and opportunities that neither of us could have imagined. He'd seen me struggle with imposter syndrome, work through technical problems that seemed insurmountable, and manage the complex emotions that came with unexpected success. But he'd also seen me persist through difficulties, learn from mistakes, and stay, committed to values that mattered regardless of external recognition or financial rewards. Perhaps most importantly, he'd learned that adults could continue growing and changing, that career paths didn't have to be linear or predictable, and that it was possible to build a life that honored multiple passions and priorities simultaneously. The afternoon meeting went better than I'd hoped. The school board voted unanimously to expand the Teacher Innovation Fellowship program, allocating additional funding for professional development, legal support, and technology infrastructure. 3 board members specifically mentioned the positive impact the program had had on teacher morale and student engagement, and one noted that the district was gaining national recognition as a leader in educational innovation. Dr. Williams pulled me aside after the meeting to discuss a new opportunity. The state education department had asked me to serve on a task force developing guidelines for teacher-entrepreneur partnerships that could be implemented statewide. The position would involve travel to the state capital, collaboration with policy makers and educational leaders, and the chance to influence legislation that could affect thousands of educators. "It's a significant time commitment," she warned. "Probably 1 week per month for the next year. Are you interested?" I thought about the ripple effects of saying yes. More time away from my classroom and my family. Additional complexity in an already demanding schedule. The pressure of helping to create policies that would affect educators and students I'd never meet, but whose lives could be improved or complicated by the decisions we made. But I also thought about Roberto and Michelle and Mrs. Chen, about all the teachers in districts across the state who might benefit from frameworks that supported their innovative instincts. I thought about students like Sophia, who deserved educational experiences that prepared them for an economy that rewarded creativity and problem-solving and entrepreneurial thinking. "Yes," I said. "I'm interested." That evening, as I was preparing dinner and thinking about how to balance yet another responsibility with my existing commitments, Marcus wandered into the kitchen with a serious expression. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever wish things had stayed the way they were before? Like when it was just you and me and Lily, and nobody knew about your business, and you didn't have to go to so many meetings and conferences?" The question caught me off guard, partly because it was so perceptive, and partly because I hadn't expected him to be thinking about these trade-offs. "What makes you ask that?" He shrugged, trying to appear casual. "Sometimes I miss when we had more time to just hang out. Like before you got famous, we used to play board games after dinner every night. Now you have phone calls and emails and stuff." My heart clenched. In all my focus on building businesses and changing educational systems, had I been neglecting the most important relationship in my life? Had the success that was supposed to improve our future been compromising our present? I knelt down so we were at eye level. "You're right that things have changed, and I'm sorry if it feels like I have less time for you. That's not what I intended." "I'm not mad," Marcus said quickly. "I'm proud of you, and I like that people think my mom is really smart and important. I just miss some of the old stuff too." I pulled him into a hug, thinking about the delicate balance between pursuing opportunities that could benefit many people and maintaining the relationships that mattered most to me personally. It was a challenge that every successful person faced, but knowing that didn't make it easier to navigate. "What if we made some changes?" I suggested. "What if we set aside specific times that are just for us, where I don't answer phone calls or check emails? And what if you helped me decide which opportunities are worth saying yes to and which ones I should decline?" His face brightened. "Really? I could help you decide about your business stuff?" "You could help me think about what's most important," I clarified. "You're good at seeing the big picture and remembering what really matters." And he was. Over the following months, Marcus became my unofficial advisor for work-life balance decisions. When I was invited to speak at a conference in California, we discussed whether the opportunity was significant enough to justify being away for 3 days. When a reporter wanted to do a feature story about our family, Marcus helped me think through the privacy implications and potential benefits. His perspective was invaluable precisely because it was uncomplicated by professional ambitions or external expectations. Marcus cared about whether I was happy, whether our family was thriving, and whether the work I was doing was making a positive difference in the world. Those were the criteria that mattered most, even when they conflicted with more conventional measures of success. The state task force work proved to be both challenging and rewarding. Over the course of a year, we developed comprehensive guidelines for districts interested in supporting teacher entrepreneurs, including legal frameworks, professional development requirements, and accountability measures. The final report was adopted by the state legislature and became a model for similar initiatives in other states. But more than the policy outcomes, I valued the relationships I built with educators from across the state who were grappling with similar questions about innovation, career development, and the future of the teaching profession. These were passionate, creative people who had ideas for improving education, but lacked the support and resources to pursue them effectively. Through our conversations and collaborative work, I gained a deeper appreciation for the systemic changes needed to transform education from a field that constrained teacher creativity to one that actively encouraged and supported it. Individual success stories were inspiring, but lasting change required institutional commitment and structural reform. As my 2-year anniversary with the district partnership approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. The external transformations were obvious: the business success, the media recognition, the policy influence, the financial security. But the internal changes felt even more significant. I'd learned to trust my instincts and abilities in ways that extended far beyond professional contexts. I'd discovered that expertise in one area could inform innovation in another, that teaching skills translated remarkably well to entrepreneurship and business development and policy work. Most importantly, I'd realized that success wasn't about choosing between competing identities or values, but about finding ways to integrate them authentically and productively. The woman who had been relegated to the kids' table at Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago had been struggling, not because she lacked capability or ambition, but because she'd accepted other people's assumptions about what was possible for someone, with her background and circumstances. The teacher who made modest wages and drove an old car wasn't failing at life. She was building something that hadn't yet become visible to the outside world. Marcus had understood this instinctively when he stood up to share my accomplishments with our extended family. He'd seen past the surface indicators that adults used to judge success and failure, recognizing the substance and potential that others had missed or dismissed. Last week, we attended another family gathering, this one for my cousin's wedding. The same relatives who had once viewed me with pity or condescension now approached me with genuine respect and curiosity. Jennifer, who had suggested I sit at the kids' table, asked detailed questions about my work with the state task force, and mentioned that her law firm was considering implementing similar innovation fellowship programs for their employees. But the most meaningful conversation of the evening happened with my nephew Tyler, who was now 7, and fascinated by stories of invention and entrepreneurship. He peppered me with questions about how businesses start, how problems become opportunities, and whether kids could be entrepreneurs too. My teacher says I'm really good at noticing things that don't work right, he told me. Like, our school's recycling system is really confusing, and lots of kids just throw everything in the regular trash because they don't know which bin to use. That sounds like exactly the kind of problem that could have a solution, I encouraged. What do you think would make the recycling system work better? Tyler launched into a detailed explanation of color-coded bins and visual guides and student ambassadors who could help their classmates learn the proper procedures. His ideas were thoughtful and practical, and his enthusiasm reminded me of my own students when they discovered that their observations and insights could lead to meaningful improvements in their community. Do you think I could actually change how our school does recycling? Tyler asked. I think you could definitely try, I said. The worst thing that could happen is that someone says no, and then you'd be exactly where you are now. But Might say yes, and then you'd have helped solve a real problem. As we talked, I realized that this was perhaps the most important impact of my journey. Not the business success or policy influence, but the example it provided for young people like Tyler and Marcus and Sophia, who were learning that they didn't have to wait for permission to solve problems or pursue their ideas. The story that began with me sitting at a kid's table, dismissed and underestimated by adults who thought they understood my limitations, had evolved into something much larger than individual achievement. It had become a demonstration that assumptions about what's possible are often wrong, that expertise can be developed and applied in unexpected ways, and that the most meaningful innovations often come from people who are closest to the problems that need solving. Marcus found me later that evening as I was helping clean up after the reception. "Mom, do you remember when Aunt Jennifer made you sit with the kids at Thanksgiving?" "I remember," I said. "Do you think she feels bad about that now?" I considered the question carefully. Jennifer had apologized multiple times over the past 2 years, expressing genuine regret about her assumptions and treatment of me. But more than that, she'd changed how she interacted with people whose circumstances she didn't fully understand, becoming more curious and less judgmental about paths that didn't match her own experience. "I think she learned something important," I told Marcus. "Sometimes the best way to help people grow is to show them different possibilities, not to lecture them about their mistakes. Like how you didn't get mad at her, but you did show everyone that they were wrong about you." "Exactly. Like that." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I think that's really smart. Like, instead of being upset about people not understanding you, you just proved that they should have understood you better." As we drove home that night, I found myself thinking about the ripple effects of that Thanksgiving dinner and Marcus's brave decision to share my accomplishments with our family. The immediate impact had been personal vindication and changed family dynamics. But the longer-term consequences had extended far beyond our individual situation. The media attention that followed had connected me with other educators facing similar challenges. The speaking opportunities had allowed me to share insights and strategies with hundreds of teachers and administrators. The policy work had created frameworks that could support thousands of educator entrepreneurs across the state. And perhaps most importantly, the visible example of a teacher who had built a successful business while maintaining her classroom commitments had challenged assumptions about what was possible within the education profession. Young people considering teaching careers could now see paths that didn't require choosing between financial security and professional passion. Experienced educators could envision ways to expand their impact without abandoning their commitment to students. The house in Maple Heights was quiet when we arrived home, with Lily already asleep upstairs and the kind of peaceful stillness that comes at the end of satisfying days. Marcus went to his room to read before bed, and I settled in my office to review emails and prepare for the next day's meetings. But before opening my laptop, I paused to look at the framed Forbes magazine cover that had started so much of this journey. The woman in that photograph looked confident and accomplished, but she also looked like someone who was just beginning to understand what might be possible. Tonight, I felt like I was that same person and also someone entirely different. The core values and commitments remained unchanged, but the scope of impact and influence had expanded in ways I could never have imagined when I was coding late at night in my small apartment, trying to solve problems in my own classroom. The email inbox contained the usual mixture of business inquiries, conference invitations, and requests for interviews or consultations. There was also a message from a teacher in Oregon who had read about our district's Teacher Innovation Fellowship program and wanted advice about starting a similar initiative in her community. Another email came from a graduate student researching entrepreneurship in education who hoped to interview me for her dissertation. Each message represented someone whose work or understanding might be influenced by the choices I'd made and the paths I'd explored. It was both humbling and energizing to realize that the decision to pursue business opportunities while maintaining teaching commitments had created possibilities for other people facing similar crossroads. Marcus appeared in my doorway in his pajamas, ready for our nightly ritual of discussing the day's events and planning for tomorrow's adventures. "Mom, do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't shown everyone your magazine that day at Thanksgiving?" It was a question I'd pondered many times myself. Would I have eventually found the courage to share my business success with my family? Would the opportunities and recognition have emerged through other channels? Would I have continued building EduFlow solutions in secret, missing out on the collaborations and partnerships that had accelerated both personal and professional growth? "I think good things would have happened eventually," I said, "but probably not as quickly, and definitely not in the same way. You helped me realize that hiding my accomplishments wasn't protecting me or helping anyone else." "I'm glad I shared," Marcus said, "because now lots of other teachers know they can start businesses too, and that's really good for kids in schools." And there it was, the perspective that had guided us through this entire journey. Not what's best for our family, or how can we become more successful, but how can we help other people and make things better for kids in schools? It was a 9-year-old's way of thinking about impact and responsibility, uncomplicated by adult anxieties about reputation and security and conventional measures of achievement. And it was exactly the kind of thinking that led to innovations and improvements that actually mattered. As I tucked Marcus into bed that night, I thought about the story I would tell him someday about this period in our lives. Not just the external, events and accomplishments, but the internal journey of learning to see constraints as creative challenges, to view expertise as transferable rather than limited, and to understand that the most meaningful success often comes from refusing to accept other people's assumptions about what's possible. The woman who had sat at the kids' table 2 years ago hadn't been lacking in capability or potential. She'd simply been operating within a framework that didn't recognize or support the full range of her talents and interests. The transformation hadn't required becoming someone different. It had required becoming more fully herself. And that, I realized, was the real lesson for Marcus and Tyler and Sophia and all the young people who were watching adults navigate questions about career and identity and success. Not that they needed to choose between passion and practicality, or that they had to accept limitations imposed by other people's narrow definitions of what was possible, but that they could build lives that honored multiple interests and values simultaneously, that they could create new paths when existing options didn't fit their goals and circumstances, and that the most meaningful innovations often came from people who refused to accept that problems were permanent or that improvement was impossible. The story that began with dismissal and underestimation had evolved into something much larger. A demonstration that assumptions about what's possible are often wrong, and that the courage to challenge those assumptions can create opportunities, not just for individuals, but for entire communities and systems. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, new questions about how to balance competing priorities and how to use growing influence responsibly. But tonight, I felt grateful for the journey that had brought us to this point, and excited about the possibilities that lay ahead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.